Good morning, AP CompGov. This is your last week only hearing my voice and not seeing my face. We're going to cover Nigeria this week, and when I come back next week, we're going to do a bunch of reviewing, and then we're going to start practicing our multiple choice questions and our FRQs and shoring up all of our knowledge in order to be prepared for the AP exam. But first, before we can do that, we have to cover the case of Nigeria. So the outline goes as follows, just like all the other ones that we've covered in this course. The introduction, the historical development of the state, its political regime, the political conflict and competition that exists within Nigeria, and there's quite a bit, the society, political economy, foreign relations in the world, and of course the current issues in Nigeria, which there are plenty of them. So first and foremost, introduction, and of course we have to cover why are we studying this case, why did the AP board pick this, or why do comparatists pick this? It's one of the most populous, it actually is the most populous country in Africa, and is expected to become the third most populous nation in the world. In 2014, it passed South Africa as the continent's largest economy. It has become renowned for political misrule, social unrest, economic inequality, and environmental degradation. And of course, it's a fascinating example of possibilities, potential limits of state power, democracy under post-colonialism with wealth of natural resources. So there's so many dynamics with Nigeria that you should study this core. You should study this country, because you have not only these four things, but again, it's rich, and we're looking at different countries around the world, and of course we get at least one sampling from the continent of Africa. Nigeria is one of 54 nations on the continent of Africa. Now, Nigeria has enormous geographical size with diverse climates and terrains. Nigeria's population is roughly 180 million, making it the most populous country in Africa and seventh most populous in the world. And by the end of the 21st century, it is expected that it will be the third largest population in the world, following China and India. The north is mostly Muslim, while the south is mostly Christian and animist. The north is also the birthplace of terrorist organization known as Boko Haram. The Niger Delta is the third largest swampland in the world and an agricultural haven. It is also home to Nigeria's huge oil deposits, but with this has come environmental degradation that has accompanied the oil production. So you have a juxtaposition between agriculture haven and of course oil deposits and mining, and so you're going to have a fight over that particular area. In Nigeria, there are roughly 250 ethnic groups. The most significant and most dominant are the Hausa, the Fulani in the north, who are Muslim, the Igbo in the southeast, who are Christians, the Yoruba in the southwest, who are Muslim and Christian, and then of course animists. So some of them are multicultural and diverse. Aside from knowing where the different religious groups and of course the different ethnic groups and where the resources are located, it's important to be aware that Nigeria has a bunch of different borders, and with these borders, with these different African countries, come different contexts and of course different issues and relationships. Nigeria is bordered to the north by Niger, to the east by Chad and Cameroon, to the south by the Gulf of Guinea of the Atlantic Ocean, and to the west of Benin. Nigeria is not only large in area, but it's larger than the United State of Texas, but also Africa's most populous country, as I've stated before. The national capital is Abuja, in the Federal Capital Territory, which was created by decree in 1976. Lagos, the formal capital, retains its standing as the country's leading commercial and industrial city. So you may see Abuja and Lagos come up, and of course Lagos was used in Captain America Civil War as one of the the grounds of terrorist activity, and of course the need for humanitarian aid, and that's not necessarily untrue. However, there's no Avengers or anything like that operating in Nigeria. So when it comes to the state, you should be aware of all these different things, from being founded in the 1100s to 2015, where former military ruler Muhammad Buhari is elected again, making the first democratic transfer of power between civilians from different parties. So we'll see how these transitions go throughout when we get to the political regimes. So Islam and the Nigerian North. It is important to note that in pre-colonial times, Nigeria was neither undeveloped nor poorly organized. Early kingdoms such as the Nok society over 2,000 years ago had a unique level of sophistication for the time in what is now central Nigeria. Around 1200 CE, the Hausa in the north established city-states along a north-south trade route. In the southwest of the country, the Yoruba established the Oyo kingdom, and the Igbo controlled the southeast, but their political power was not centralized. Again, it was more federal. Islam appeared in the Hausa region in the 11th century, and by the 15th century it had brought literacy and scholarship to the region. Usman Dan Fodio was a religious scholar who played a crucial role in spreading Islam. He also declared jihad against the Hausa city-states in 1804, and by 1808 it had overthrown them and established a Sokoto Caliphate. So again, it goes back to the religious Islam state, that's what a caliphate is. It is a religious Islamic state, which is now what ISIS is trying to establish in part of Syria, Iraq, etc. And so that's where Boko Haram is associated with ISIS, because they believe in the same idea of establishing a caliphate to bring about the end times and having Islam take over the world. So between the 17th and 19th centuries, Europeans established ports to support the slave trade. Britain was the main trading partner, and more than 3 million slaves were shipped to the Americas. Britain declared the slave trade illegal in 1807, but British industrialization had created demand for Nigerian resources, so they relied on local slavery to produce these goods. It's important to know that in northern Africa, slavery exists today, African on African, etc. Slavery has been a timeless evil, and at times a necessary economic use. I'm not saying necessary as far as I condone it morally speaking, but it is a lucrative way to build a society in order to make it low cost, etc. Of course, now we don't need that. Capitalism has eradicated poverty, or at least has eradicated super poverty around the world, and we are now experiencing the idea of choices being made. It is now you get to choose where you work, etc. The Oyo Empire collapsed, excuse me, and the British started to convert the Yoruba to Christianity, which again, remember the British, they had the Anglican Church, etc. The 19th century saw the scramble for Africa as many European powers established colonial holdings. Great Britain established control of both the north and the south. In many instances, it practiced indirect control. When the Sokoto Caliphate came under British rule, the colonial administration respected and left in place Sharia, also known as Islamic law. All British-controlled territories came together under the name of Nigeria in 1914, and the British began to develop the region's infrastructure. Exposure to Western ideas meant that Nigerians adopted several ideas and concepts such as sovereignty, nationalism, and self-rule, and thus developed resistance to the colonizers. After a while, they did become bitter, which is what we see quite a bit in colonial areas. So, independence, conflict, and civil war. In 1960, Nigeria formally gained independence, and it sought to create the first republic. The British government set up a new federal structure consisting of 3 regions: northern, western, and eastern. In 1965, amid severe unrest and violence in the western region, an Igbo coup overthrew the government. Coup leaders assassinated the prime minister. Leaders of several political parties and many northern military officials also saw their end. And the constitution was suspended and political parties were banned. Going back to that, how this was founded was a leader by the name of Azakawi. Nigerian born, he studied and taught in the United States and then returned to Nigeria in 1938. He founded the NCNC in 1944, The NPC and the AGP were organized around the same time, those are different parties. There were British support for independence, and so it was achieved without bloodshed that typically accompanied decolonization in the region. Okay. The elections of 1959 led to the coalition between MPC and the NCNC. At the same time, the AGP, which we'll get into, fragmented due to infighting and riots, all of which led to the imposition of emergency rule over the Western region, which we see back in 1965 issue. The 1965 elections in the Western region were contentious and, of course, led to violence that claimed over 2,000 lives. Following the violence, the Igbo military officers staged a coup. Instead of peace, the coup brought about a civil war. In May 1967, the eastern region, which is dominated by Igbo, seceded and formed the Republic of Biafra. Azikwe, an ethnic Igbo, supported the secession independence. However, in 1970, the Biafra was defeated. It was a very costly war. The military era. The Igbo takeover triggered a counter-coup in which the military imposed the FMG under the leadership of Gowon while promising a return to civilian rule. By the mid-1970s, Gowon's regime had lost its power. He was overthrown in a bloodless coup in 1975, and Muhammad took over. Muhammad was assassinated within a year, bringing Obasanjo to power, and he continued to support Muhammad's plan for the restoration of civilian rule. In 1979, a new constitution was ratified and the Second Republic began. Obasanjo left the government and the military and went on to have an illustrious role in international and non-governmental organizations. He ended up doing a lot of advocating and wheeling and dealing. The winner of the 1979 elections was Shagarai, a northerner. Following those elections, the traditionally ethnically based parties experienced a resurgence. In 1983, Shagarai's government attempted to stay in power by rigging the elections. The military returned to power, and this time under the leadership of General Babangida, a Muslim whom it tried to remedy with, fixing the economic crises that followed. Of course, he tried to implement neoliberal structural adjustment programs, very similar to what the IMF and World Bank and even Washington Consensus advocate for. But all this, he annulled the Third Republic's 93 presidential election. And of course, during that time, they was basically overthrown, and his second in command, Sani Abacha, came into power, and he used violence as a means of public control, and he stole $6 billion roughly from the state, and arguably from the people of Nigeria. In 1999, after this corruption had been brought to light, the Fourth Republic brought Obasanjo back to power with free presidential elections, even though he had rigged it to begin with or previously. It's very interesting. Now, this very strange and kind of hodgepodge leadership, all these different coups and the military coups, etc., brings us to what we would be asking all along is, what about their political regime? Okay, so we're going to be talking about their different structures. First, we have their constitution. The patrimonialism has been a single most prominent form of government, which is always a problem. It is not only means of personal rule by authoritarian leaders, but also distributing huge economic privileges to supporters. Both military and civilian governments have used this paradigm where they are basically kind of bribing people to a certain degree. Regimes have switched back and forth between military and civilian governments since its independence, but none have been successful in delivering on its promises because of the corruption and a lack of infrastructure and systems being in place to allocate funds, etc. The British wrote the first colonial constitution and then rewrote it 3 times to better reflect decentralized federalism. The first national constitution kept the regime of a constitutional monarchy with a parliamentary democracy. In 1963, after only 3 years of independence, Nigeria reconstituted itself as a republic. The military ceded to a civilian government in 1979. And the constitution of that year introduced a presidential system reminiscent of the U.S. system, and a more recent constitution has kept all the presidential arrangements, and we're going to be looking at that. They also have a bicameral legislature. Now, when it comes to the executive branch, okay, in its nearly 6 decades of independence, Nigeria has been ruled for half of this time by patrimonial strongmen. Again, giving favors, and it's basically whether this happened using this patrimonialism it has contributed to the immensely unequal distribution of wealth in the country, which is unfortunate. The current president, Muhammadu Buhari, is the 6th democratically elected executive to govern Nigeria, and the first to defeat an incumbent in a democratic election, and these results were verified. The president, directly elected by the people, and appoints ministers to Federal Executive Council. The federal character principle requires appointment of ministers from each state of the area, so there's some representation happening. The 2015 elections were significant because it was the first time that the incumbent had lost power, and there was no violence. It was actually the most peaceful transition of power between opposing parties in recent times for Nigeria. So it's very important to note that this is an issue. Now, this is a picture of President Muhammadu Buhari. He is the 6th democratically elected president and the first one to get into office by defeating an incumbent. He first ruled Nigeria after staging a military coup back in '83, and he was ousted in another coup in '85, and then he finally won the presidency in 2015 after competing in 3 different presidential election cycles without success. So I guess 4th time's the charm for him. Many Nigerians believed that he is corrupt, and that he failed in '83. Once you have failed once, you do not get to go again, but he was democratically elected. Therefore, he is in power. Now, when it comes to the legislature, it's important to note before we talk about the national, that the Nigerian legislative complex is made up of legislative institutions and agents at the federal, state, and local government levels, so there is a form of federalism. It also encompasses the elected and statutorily designated legislatures at the 3 levels across 3 arms of government: the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. The legislative process and the Nigerian people whose mandate and objectives define its overriding objectives. There are also some key legislative research and development centers and legislative advocacy groups and platforms which operations affect the legislative direction and agenda for the Nigerian statecraft. You can look those up on the internet. Each region, each miniature nation, little state in Nigeria has these centers, and they're advocating for the success of Nigeria. However, most of our study is going to be focusing on the national legislature. Nigeria's federal legislative body, the National Assembly, consists of 2 houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Again, remember, this is reminiscent of the United States government. All members of the National Assembly are elected directly every 4 years. Although, as the consequence of being a former British colony, Nigeria started out with a parliamentary system of government at independence in 1960. It switched to a presidential system modeled after the U.S. in '79. This was done primarily to achieve a more enhanced separation of powers and checks and balances among the 3 branches of government. Again, they're looking to root out corruption and all those different issues there. To that end, in addition to its legislative mandate, the current constitution accords the National Assembly extensive oversight powers. These include control over the spending of federal funds, the authority to provide advice and consent for appointments to key executive positions, the power to approve all treaties negotiated by the executive, and the power to impeach the president and his deputy. Various elected and unelected officers are instrumental to the functioning of the National Assembly. Key members of the National Assembly leadership include the Majority Leader, the Minority Leader, the Chief Whip, the Minority Whip, and among the unelected officers of the National Assembly are the Clerk and the Sergeant at Arms. Also crucial to the power functioning of the body are the various committees. While the Nigerian Constitution requires each House of the National Assembly to form at least 2 committees, a Joint Committee on Finance and a Public Accounts Committee, it permits each body to form as many other committees as it deems fit. The National Assembly may establish various forms of committees, special committees, standing committees, ad hoc committees, and committees of the whole. The legislative process in Nigeria involves both houses of the National Assembly and the president. Typically, once a bill, which could be an executive bill, a private bill, or a member's bill, is introduced in the National Assembly, it goes through a rigorous process before it's enacted into law, which includes at least 3 readings of the bill, scrutiny by the relevant committee where amendments may be made, and of course the president's assent. Again, very similar to the United States and how it functions. So remember that for Nigeria, they've modeled their newest form of government after ours. The government structure, as you can see here, is the lines of control. The electorate goes ahead and they elect the president. They elect the local, state, and governments, the governors, the state legislatures, the local governments, the traditional authorities, and they also elect the National Assembly. And then the National Assembly goes ahead and deals with the judiciary with the president. So it's an important structure to note, committed to memory, but it shouldn't be that hard, seeing that it's almost a dead ringer for ours, except we have a long-standing history of having valid elections and a lack of military coups. Now the judiciary. The court system, again, has retained a degree of independence and legitimacy. In 1994, however, Abacha created a military tribunal to conduct the show trials of activist and playwright Ken Saro-Wiwa and 8 others. In November 1995, the government hanged all 9 defendants. And so they end up having the courts be intimidated. And they become complacent. The return to democratic rule also meant an attempt to return to an independent judiciary, meaning you're not having the president or a dictator influence so harsh that people are put to death without a real trial. In 1999, the Constitution created a Supreme Court, a Federal Court of Appeals, and a unified court system nationwide. The federal structure of Nigeria makes it possible for states to authorize traditional subsidiary courts, which often have a lot of clout. These include Sharia law courts in 12 northern states and 8 that are predominantly Muslim. So they have local law, very similar to other countries. Like Israel also has religious courts that serve each community, and then they work their way up to the main court system. Now, the electoral system itself, the president again serves 4-year terms, must maintain both overall majority of nationwide votes, at least 25% of ballots cast in 2/3 of the states, and of course there can be a runoff with top 2 candidates. It's an optional thing. The House of Representatives seats are contested in single-member districts that are apportioned by population. The Senate seats elected from the single-member districts as well. The threshold to win the presidency is very high in accordance with the requirements of the Constitution. If no candidate clears the threshold, the 2 top voters are going to go to a runoff. The informal system of zoning means that every 2 terms, priorities will alternate between nominating a Southerner or a Northerner as their presidential candidates. Legislative elections are run through single-member districts for both the House and the Senate. For Senate elections, each state is divided into 3 districts, which is how 36 states elect 108 senators. In addition, the capital territory of Abuja elects 1 senator, very much similar to the Washington, D.C. receiving representation in the House. Okay, local government, there's going to be 36 states plus the federal capital territory. The states cannot generate revenue because the federal government controls the purse strings, and those strings are attached to oil revenues. The derivation formula is the principle for distributing the revenues, and it has been a huge subject for debate. So essentially the national government, while there is federalism in place, is controlling the revenue and the economic success of these different states. And that is unfortunate because it's going to lead to a huge dispute between the different areas of the country over who gets what. The military is Nigeria's most powerful leaders. Even if its elected presidents they have had usually strong military backgrounds. The military has served as one of the few stable avenues for a meritocracy, and of course there's some social mobility there. Despite Nigeria's history of coups, the military has not yet intervened in the Fourth Republic. It's kind of kept its distance. The 2000s legislation required retirement of all military officers who previously held office during military rule. The government seized senior officers' corruptly acquired assets, and the military dismissal performance against Boko Haram has tarnished the image, meaning they've done a dismal job, just pathetic as far as actually eradicating this terrorist organization. Kidnappings, murders, IEDs, bombs, etc. Boko Haram has been terrorizing Nigeria on and off, and the military seems to be doing a lackluster job on actually thwarting them, halting them, eradicating, whatever you want to call it. Boko Haram is still alive and well in the bush, receiving funding and support from ISIS, and Nigeria has yet to eradicate. Next, we have the political conflict and competition, as you can see, of having military leaders in the fray over the history of time, and other types of coups and corruption. Of course, there's going to be political conflict and competition. Of course. So first, we have these different parties. So the political parties reflect ethnic divisions of identity rather than actual left-right ideological continuum like what we have in the United States. It's more about ethnic tensions than right versus left. So the People's Democratic Party, also known as PDP, is a major contemporary political party in Nigeria. Its policies generally lie toward the center-right of the political spectrum. It won every presidential election between 1999 and 2011, and was until the 2015 elections that they were the governing party of the Fourth Republic, although in some cases amid a few controversial electoral circumstances. Okay, so there were some spotty elections happening between 1999 and 2011. Currently, the PDP controls 14 states out of 36 states in Nigeria, so the governorships, 14 out of 36, are controlled by the PDP. The All Progressives Congress, APC, is a political party in Nigeria formed on the 6th of January in 2013 in anticipation solely for the 2015 elections. The APC candidate, which was Muhammadu Buhari, won the presidential election by almost 2.6 million votes. The incumbent president, Goodluck Jonathan, conceded defeat on March 31st. This was the first time in Nigeria's political history that an opposition political party unseated a governing party in a general election, and one where, again, what we've mentioned before, the transfer of power happened peacefully. Who could have thunk it? In addition, the APC won the majority of seats in the Senate and the House of Representatives in that particular election, though it fell shy of winning the supermajority to override the ability of the opposition of the PDP to block legislation. So the PDP still has some say in what is happening in the branches. Okay, for elections, to support the federal character of the country, the Election Commission only approved parties with well-established nationwide organizations for the 1999 presidential elections. 9 parties qualified for local elections, and the top 3 were allowed to run candidates in the national, legislative, and presidential elections. The 3 parties approved for 1993 reflected the ethnic dividing lines, the PDP representing the northern Hausa, the APP, which has kind of fallen into ruin, representing the eastern Igbo, and the AD representing the western Yoruba. In preparation for the 2015 elections, it was clear that Goodluck Jonathan would pursue re-election in spite of the zoning arrangement. To defeat him, in 2013, 3 opposition parties and some members of a 4th party merged to form an all-progressives Congress, meaning they got rid of their fraction parties and joined up into one. The APC ended up winning the election, and the former military leader Buhari became president. It was the first election, again, where the power was transferred peacefully. I harp on this because you're going to probably see a question about this in on the AP exam. I can't imagine it not be. These are key moments in the regime's history, and you're going to probably end up needing to compare it to maybe a Russian transfer of power, or Mexico, or United Kingdom, etc. We'll be practicing that when I come back. Okay, with democracy, is often brought about clientelism, ethnic violence, and incompetent leaders. Again, corruption just it ruins everything. In 2015, 70% of Nigerians said that they were not very all satisfied with how democracy works in Nigeria. Again, I think it has to do with the violence and corruption and incompetency. And maybe their system for choosing candidates could be indicative of or a cause for this issue. Oil revenues have allowed for a one-party dominance and corruption in its democratic system. Surpluses have used as a slush fund by the incumbent party to, co-op support, meaning buyouts. In 2011, the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority was established to insulate oil revenues from politicians' grasp. So they had to establish independent commissions to divvy out the money because, again, when you have a oil-rich country or any type of resource-rich country, there's always an idea of having issues with corruption in the allocation of. So, the elections. We have covered mostly the 2015, but we are going to have a new election in 2019. So 4 years ago, we have Buhari dominating the north and southwest of the country, which is under the APC. Now, their main party rival, the PDP, was more popular in the south and southeast. Okay. However, unlike in the 2015 election, when a northerner, Mr. Buhari, faced a southerner, the incumbent President Goodluck Jonathan, this time the main challenger is the PDP's Atiku Abubakar, which is also from the north. So you now have northerner versus northerner. Analysts say that the election is too difficult to call. The result is likely to be very close when it's done. The APC could suffer in the country's middle belt, which is Benue and the Nasarawa states, as there is dissatisfaction with the failure to deal with communal violence there, and that's a huge issue. The APC is popular in the two states with the largest number of voters, Lagos and Kano, but there is a danger of voter apathy, and a low turnout could become a huge problem. Now, there's some key issues in this election. Money. If you look up the money gap, there's an income map that you can, I'll have to post on Classroom for you guys. But when you look at it, it's going to reveal a clear regional divide in how wealthy Nigerians are, with the north being much poorer than the south of the country. President Buhari's home state, Katsina, in northern Nigeria, is the poorest area, but the average annual income per person is less than $400, just over $1 a day. Excluding the capital, Abuja, Lagos is the richest state and country's commercial hub, but the average annual income per person is nearly $8,000. The relative wealth of the southern states, Delta, Bayelsa, Rivers, and Akwa Ibom, is a result of the oil industry. And the figures represent the means of the average. So I'm going to post that on Classroom. It'll be posted when you guys are listening to this this PowerPoint on YouTube. I will have that posted for you guys. Unemployment. Every year, many thousands of young Nigerians start looking for jobs, but there are few opportunities for formal work. Okay, sustainable job creation was one of the challenges for Nigeria that accountancy firms have identified as the main struggle for Nigeria's growth. In general, despite some downturns, the economy has grown strongly since 2000, but unemployment remains stubbornly high. And nationally, it stands over just 23%. And that's a lot, okay? If we can contrast it with the United States, we're at like 3.9% unemployment. They're at 23%. That's more of our Depression era numbers. Strangely enough, some of the states, mostly in the oil-rich South, with a high average income, also have high unemployment, as well as pointing to income inequalities to suggest that the oil industry is not producing enough jobs for the actual population of Nigeria. Remember, they are growing at a rapid rate. We also have a huge issue of violence and security, because there's plenty of intercommunal and Islamic-inspired violence, accounting for nearly 10,000 deaths over the last 4 years. Despite some military successes, in 2015, especially in retaking territory from the Islamist group Boko Haram in the northeast, there has been recent upsurge in the attacks by these militant groups. In the northwest, especially in the Zamfara state, things appear to be worsening, with armed bandits attacking villages and killing and abducting members of society for ransom, as well as stealing cattle. The age-old conflict between settled farmers and nomadic herders has worsened in the last few years, especially in central Nigeria. Mr. Buhari's government has been criticized for its poor handling of the situation, but the conflict appears to have subsided ahead of the elections. However, it's important to note, if we look at the history in the continent of Africa when it comes to herders versus farmers, it can lead to ethnic cleansing. That's exactly what happened in South Sudan. In the Darfur region, it could happen in Nigeria if the Nigerian government is not careful. You could see herders turn on farmers and vice versa, and you could see a huge issue arise. So it's important to note that. We also have the issue of ethnic diversity, going back to their huge population of 180 million people. They have numerous ethno-linguistic groups. The Hausa Fulani people based in the north are mostly Muslim. The Yorubas, again, in the southwest are split between Muslims and Christians, and the Igbos in the southeast are mostly Christian, or they follow traditional African religions. Both main presidential candidates, Mr. Buhari and Mr. Abubakar, are Fulanis, with running mates from the south. President Buhari's deputy is Yemeni Obasanjo, a Yoruba pastor and former law professor, and Mr. Abubakar has chosen Peter Obi, an Igbo politician. So we're going to be seeing some interesting stuff there. And finally, another issue in Nigeria is education. And it's important to know that's the struggle. According to the UN's Children Agency, which is UNICEF, 1 in every 5 of the world's out-of-school children is in Nigeria. But the percentage of school-age children actually in education varies wildly across the country. There's a sharp regional divide, with the proportion of children going to school generally lower in the north, obviously because that's where they're poorer. It's estimated that 10.5 million children between ages 5 and 14 are out of school. Last October, a UNICEF official said that 69% of those were in northern Nigeria, the highest figure being in the Bauchi state, followed by Mr. Buhari's home state of Katsina. The government's National Economic Council recommended in October 2018 that a state of emergency be declared in the education sector to address, amongst other things, the number of out-of-school children, meaning they are not in school, they could potentially be working or something along those lines. Literacy rates are generally low in the north, and especially for women and girls. That's another huge issue that comes into play, is literacy. If you cannot read or write or do arithmetic, your country cannot further itself. Civil society. In the post-colonial era, a number of formal interest groups and informal voluntary associations emerged and have persisted. Several groups were organized as issue-based organizations aiming to protect the interests of ethnic groups in the Niger Delta. The movement of the survival of the Ogoni people was established by Ken Saro-Wiwa to secure financial benefits for the inhabitants of the region where oil was found. Some groups turned to violence, such as the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta, which has illegally siphoned off oil, kidnapped foreign oil workers and sailors, captured ships, and attacked facilities. Boko Haram, which roughly translates to Western education is forbidden, and Houssa is a group that aims again to establish a new Islamic caliphate. However, Boko Haram is an extremist, and there are many liberal Muslim groups in favor of secular government residing in Nigeria. So let's talk about the society itself. So we look at ethnic groups. Again, we have the Hausa and the Fulani, 29%, the Yoruba, and 21%, the Ibu or Igbo, 18%, the Ija, 10%, and then, Ibabu, Tiva, Kanuri, you can see all these things here. 50% Muslim, 40% Christian, 10% indigenous beliefs. Military leaders typically and routinely stoke fears of ethnic conflict just to justify their authoritarianism. That's a huge issue that Nigeria has faced. Once military rule ended, communal violence arose. To this day is no longer able to repress the public. So again, you're looking at a republic democracy. Incomes in the Northeast are half what they are in the South, and in the Northeast, women's literacy rates are under 5%. Islam is diverse in Nigeria. The lower class Hausa Muslims practice Sufi Islam, and while the Hausa and Fulani elites practice Orthodox Sunni Islam. Muslims see Sharia as a good way to combat the corruption of the military era and to reassert their rights in the democratic system. But imposing Sharia has led to worse violence since the end of the military rule, because Sharia calls for violence towards aggressors or people who violate the law, using hands, arms, etc. for doing the wrong thing or what they perceive as the wrong thing. Ideology and political culture. Ideology plays a limited role compared to narrow communal concerns. There's a low sense of patriotism. They've never really had a strong sense of like Nigeria, much like the United States. They're not having 4th of July and things like that. It's more of a local identity versus, statewide or nationwide. 69% of Nigerians continue to support democracy and they reject military rule, but they do not like what's happening here as far as a single party dominate or having this issue where there's still corruption. Nigerians are uniquely unpatriotic because they are mired in ethnic and regional identity. However, a 2012 survey found that 62% of Nigerians support democracy, although the number is down from 84% in 2000. So they're becoming disenchanted with some of the shortcomings of democracy, majority rule, with minority rights, etc., like that. Now, political economy is going to be pretty straightforward. The Nigerians have a resource curse. As far as they are Africa's largest economy, oil is about 90% of its foreign currency earnings. Despite having this large economy, Nigeria is ranked 152nd out of 188 countries on the Human Development Index. They have a resource curse. We talked about this back in our chapter on political economy, way back in the first quarter. The resource curse, again, is the affliction caused by abundant natural resources distorting an economy by preventing diversification. As you can see here, the 70% system, over 70% of the population lives on less than $2 per day, but 70% of Nigerians' wealth is held by 1% of the population. State-controlled natural resources also serve to support non-democratic rule. Again, when you're stuck with only you're good at one thing, you're just stuck in a rut. And those in power like to keep that rut because they can stay in power. They have some contemporary reforms. They've tried to alleviate corruption and economic issues. They, from 03 to 07, they had NEEDS, which is basically a strategy to audit government, to oversee spending and provide information for public, and basically try to root out financial crimes. The Goodluck Jonathan government restructured foreign debt. They modernized the banking system. They privatized the electrical production and attracted some foreign investment, which is good. You need foreign investment for a country to thrive, regardless of location in the world. And the Buhari government has arrested a number of former government officials and has recovered about $1.5 billion in stolen revenue. $1.5 billion stolen. That's insane. Now, with foreign relations in the world, Nigeria has some interesting relationships. Again, they're very close with Great Britain. They're a former colony of, and Nigerians are afforded specific certain privileges. They can enlist into the United Kingdom's military for benefits there, but it's pretty hard to do so. They do have some interesting ties there. So during its peaceful transition, Nigeria has had pretty good relations with the Western countries. They remained pretty much pro-Western camp during the Cold War. Briefly, the EU and the US imposed some sanctions following the Saro-Wiwa's execution. It was like, hey, you can't just kill people. Nigeria has also sought to play an important regional role in IGOs. They have the ECOWAS and the African Union. It's important to note that Morocco is not a part of the African Union. Why? It's debated, but you guys can look into that later. But Morocco is not a part of the African Union. Fun fact. And of course, they have taken a strong stance on supporting African democracy. They don't want dictatorships in the continent of Africa. They want to see all 54 nations in Africa be free and have peace. And of course, we talked about the oil. Nigeria has enough oil to make it a very important trading partner for Europe, Asia, and North America. But the instability in the Middle East is going to push Nigeria to the forefront of energy production. But again, you also have Boko Haram operating, so that's kind of a yes and a no at the same time. All right, some other current issues aside from the election ones that we've talked about. So, Boko Haram has been gaining strength. in recent years because of ISIS's prominence. However, ISIS is being beaten back by the current Trump administration, so ISIS is struggling to maintain its control in Syria and northern Iraq. It's looking like ISIS has had to retreat into the background. That being said, Boko Haram is still alive and well in Nigeria. The leader of Boko Haram was executed in 2009, and the group has led increasingly frequent and deadly terrorist attacks. Its goal is to root out Western influences and establish an Islamic caliphate in northern Nigeria. Again, their goals match ISIS's. The military and police force in response has been indiscriminate as that of the terrorists, meaning they are just as brutal, and the people are suffering with this lack of discrimination as far as noting the difference between the civilians and the terrorists. As much as 500,000 barrels stolen per day by local militias and gangsters, which is a huge amount of resources being siphoned off. And then, of course, you have oil production contaminating the Niger's tropical ecosystem. And so impoverished communities are being even more angry, and they're organizing because their lands and their agriculture and things like that, their livelihoods are being poisoned by this oil, this lack of good infrastructure and drilling. It's terrible. Okay. So the resource curse itself. Nigeria's vast resources have a great source of wealth, but this resource curse has also fostered endemic corruption and violence and exacerbated income inequality, has caused untold environmental damage, and as you can see in this picture, it's a travesty. It's not like how we see in the United States where we drive down, Highway 5 to Disneyland and we look and see some oil, being drilled slowly but surely with the machines, and you see nothing but the machine going up and down. Obviously, here you see the resource bleeding into the surrounding area. Be aware of the essential political features. You need to have them memorized. You should know them by heart. The heads of government, pay attention to this. Again, in 2019, we're going to figure out if it's going to be Buhari again or his challenger, and that remains to be seen. But you should be aware of the transitions of power, especially the one in 2015 with the new peaceful transfer of power. Despite a succession of democratic elections, political violence, among other problems, threatens Nigeria's democracy. There's always an issue here, and there's always, the threat of murder and things like that. And behind these politicians is, people suffering. And so that needs to be addressed. And that's a struggle for Nigeria. Okay, these are just a nice picture from the 2015 elections. This is an election worker marking the finger of a Nigerian voter. That's their, I voted sticker. They actually color the fingers in that region of the world. Observers actually judged the 2015 election as Nigeria's cleanest polling to date. So it's the cleanest election that they've had since they've gone into a democratic republic. And of course, if you look at their democracy and economy, Nigeria's good democracy percentage is 59%, strong economy 40%. And if you look at the comparison with Russia, Russia does not have a good democracy in the eyes of the people. The 15% say it's a good democracy, but 74% say they have a strong economy. So you're looking and seeing, if you had to choose between a good democracy or a strong economy, which would you say is more important? Nigeria says democracy is more important, while Mexico is kind of almost even, same thing with China. But Russia says you don't need a good democracy, you need a strong economy, which goes right back to the Cold War stance and the haves and the have-nots, which has been in their subconscious since that time. Participation in the labor force. You can see here 70% of it's agricultural, 20% is services, 10% industry. And again, agriculture is being threatened by the oil pollution. And then, of course, we have Boko Haram. The insurgent Islamic group has been the source of much controversy in Nigeria. Here in the Baga village, a poster advertises the search for Boko Haram leader Shekaku, and that reward is quite high for that particular country. Now concludes our lecture on Nigeria. We'll go back and look at some stuff when I come back next week. We'll spend each day will be a different country and case study, so we cover up and kind of address any concerns or questions. That being said, enjoy watching This Is Nigeria. It's not a spoof video, but it's a Nigerian artist's rendition of Childish Gambino's "This Is America." This is Nigeria, and it's been confirmed that most of the things that are said in that music video are indicative or true of Nigeria. Also, please be aware of the different regions as you do your maps. Make sure you go ahead and take care of your terms, and be aware of your readings, because when I come back and we're going to be going over the readings, you're going to have a lot of graded discussions and in-class writes on these things. So it's important, if you have not been reading, to have read your stuff by the time I come back, because it gets real again. Because I'm back, people. I'm back. See you guys next week.